Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. My name is Anita. I'm a product manager at Evercity. Evercity is a sustainability measurement and investment platform, and one of our key products is EU Taxonomy screening tool. So today I would like to walk you through the details of this regulation, cover which steps it includes, and also talk a little bit about EU Greenbon standard. Many people know about EU taxonomy because it's a, it's a regulation that influences most companies in the EU. However, not many people know that it also offers opportunities for fundraising, and I would like to cover that as well because it might provide additional incentives for companies to report. My presentation will be divided into two big parts. First, we'll go through EU taxonomy, and then we will go to EU Greenbon standard. I will pause after the first part so we can have a small discussion there and then proceed to the next one. And also, please feel free to write messages in the chat, so I'll be happy to answer them. Now, so EU taxonomy and EU Greenbon standard are essentially a part of the European Green Deal. It's important to understand, just to see a big picture, that there is a big regulation related to sustainability in the EU, and it covers many different aspects. And what regards financing is covered by taxonomy and by EU Greenbon standards. So this is all a part of green financing strategy under EU Green Deal. So how is a taxonomy related to EU Greenbon standard, and how is it all connected? So it's sometimes a little bit unclear. So EU taxonomy is essentially a classification system of economic activities that can contribute to different environmental objectives. It is based on technical screening criteria. Yes, I'm sure you know that. So EU taxonomy is linked to several regulations. So first, it's linked to a non-financial reporting directive, NFRD, which will be replaced by Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So under those directives, companies have to report according to EU taxonomy. It is also linked to SFDR, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which relates to asset managers. So it's a regulation for investors to report. But at the same time, it also is a prerequisite for EU Greenbon standard. So if a company wants to issue a bond, a green bond under EU Greenbon standard, it will have to perform eligibility screening under EU taxonomy. So EU Greenbon standard is still not fully ready, but all the materials are there and we can already see how it is going to work. So this is just a landscape so that we all know what we are talking about. So what is the motivation for companies and for different entities to report according to EU taxonomy? The motivation differs for financial and non-financial entities, but there are some common features as well. So first, there are regulatory requirements. So we all know about that currently the companies that are big, that are listed, have more than 500 employees, they need to provide reports. So they need to report on EU taxonomy within their annual report or sustainability report or somehow else. So they need to provide this information. Then the scope will increase with CSRD. Under SFDR, companies asset managers also need to report on product level on EU taxonomy. So this is the first part. The problem here is that still currently there are no penalties. So many companies might consider it to be not such a strong incentive, because if there are no penalties, there is still room to avoid some regulation and so on. So this is still a little bit tricky, but it will probably get stricter in the years to come. But there's also other motivation. There are, of course, reputational risks because the landscape of financing system in the EU is becoming more and more oriented towards sustainability. So if you don't provide these reports, if you don't report on sustainability on the EU taxonomy, it might influence the company's reputation and image in the eyes of investors and consumers and so on. Yeah, and so this is like a negative motivation. The positive motivation will be to enhance your green brand, to have some additional competitive advantages. So if you meet EU taxonomy, if you have higher alignment percentage than your competitors, of course, it is better for your company. And then green transition. So EU taxonomy helps to screen your company to understand where it stands, yeah, so what is its level, and after this to develop some approaches for sustainability transition. So this is something in common for financial and non-financial entities, but they also have their different motivations. So for non-financial entities, a big motivation is requirements of their investors. So if you get money from a bank, from credit institution, or from asset manager, it's highly likely that they will need to report and they will ask you to provide the information to them. And this is quite a strong motivation for companies um, because essentially for financial entities, there is a need to collect all the data on company level, which they don't have. And it might also put pressure on the companies to report. Additional motivation is access to green finance under EU Greenbon standard, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So for financial entities, another motivation would be green labeling of their financial products. So there is also a separate labeling procedure under EU taxonomy. So it also includes such parts for financial products. And also they can label their funds according to SFDR as Article 8 or 9. So of course, it is something needed for the fund if they want to be considered as sustainable. What are the timelines? So again, it's good to remember them. They are sometimes a little bit flexible, so they shift, but this is what they look like for now. Currently, we know that there is non-financial reporting directive in place. In 2022, companies had to report on eligibility. In 2023, it is alignment, and later on we will discuss the difference between eligibility and alignment in more detail. And next year it will also be alignment, yeah, for non-financial entities. The difference is that currently not all materials are ready in taxonomy. So taxonomy covers 6 environmental objectives. Currently there is data for only 2 of them, and the rest will come hopefully next year. So this is what is expected. So the scope of NFRD covers about 11,000 entities, so large companies with over 500 employees, and it also includes for financial entities. Well, for them, the timeline is a bit different. In 2023, they report on eligibility, and in 24 on alignment. Credit institutions also have their separate KPIs, which will fall into place a little bit later. So this is the first part. Now we go to SFDR. So what is it? It is a regulation for reporting for investment firms and asset managers. So it is a reporting for funds, and it includes taxonomy as one of the parts of the reporting, but it's not all of it. So SFDR currently requires taxonomy reporting, but from January, there will also be a requirement to report on RTS, regulatory technical standards, another set of criteria and questionnaires. And then there is principal adverse impact. So probably the biggest challenge in SFDR is principal adverse impacts, which will come later next year. And finally, we get CSRD. So it's long awaited, and it will substantially increase the scope of EU taxonomy reporting. So if now we talk about 11,000 entities, when CSRD comes into force, it will be like 50,000 entities and even more. So from 2025, it will include only NFRD companies, then all large companies, then listed SMEs. And there will be some additional criteria which not only relate to EU taxonomy, but also some broader sustainability reporting. So this is what is out there, and this is how the regulation looks like currently. Now, let's say we realize that your company is in scope of EU taxonomy, or probably it will be in scope, and you need to start somewhere. So what do? How do you actually start reporting on EU taxonomy? Let's just have a brief introduction to what actually taxonomy is and what it covers. So basically, it is a set of environmentally sustainable activities and technical screening for these activities. So these activities cover many sectors of the economy, not all of them. So for now, for example, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, manufacturing of different consumer goods, it's not included in taxonomy. So it's now more about um, energy or manufacturing of some raw materials like metals and so on. Uh, so, but also transport and buildings and many other activities, but it doesn't cover the whole set of potential economic activities. Then it introduces technical screening criteria. So activities can be screened according to different environmental objectives. So there is a concept of environmental objective. It's like an overall goal, which is in priority for the European Union. So there are currently 6 environmental objectives: mitigation, adaptation, water, transition to circular economy, pollution prevention, and ecosystems. So to be aligned with the EU taxonomy, the activity needs to substantially contribute to at least one environmental objective and do no significant harm to other objectives. So this is like a two-step screening process. So what it means in practice, it's sometimes not really clear. So let's say that, for example, you're working in climate mitigation and you're, for example, producing really low carbon aluminum. So uh, you have like some technology which helps to substantially reduce CO2 emissions from aluminum below the industry average. So you substantially contribute to mitigation. But if at the same time your activity uh, is not well adapted to climate risks, so you didn't, for example, assess them. So if it's in maybe a zone that is vulnerable to sea level rise, or if you have high pollution, or if your activity doesn't support ecosystems, if you harm biodiversity and so on, you cannot claim that you're aligned with the taxonomy. So this is what it means to substantially contribute to one and do no significant harm to others. So with do no significant harm, it's quite difficult to do the assessment right now because the criteria are very qualitative. So it's sometimes hard to interpret them for companies still. But maybe they will become clearer in the future and maybe there will be some more concrete expectations. Uh, and finally, the taxonomy also has KPIs. So for each type of an entity, there are some KPIs that they have to report on. For example, for non-financial entities, it would be turnover, capex, opex. For asset managers, it would be something related to their portfolio and the share of aligned companies in their portfolio. So for banks, they would have to screen all their financial portfolio, including loans, advances, credit, and so on. So this is essentially what taxonomy has. Now, you start reporting. So what do? The first step and the first requirement, which we saw, it was already in it, eligibility screening. So eligibility screening is understanding what out of the activities that your company performs is in scope of the EU taxonomy. So for example, let's say that you're working in sustainable agriculture in the European Union and you're implementing like best practices and so on. However, agriculture is currently not in scope of the EU taxonomy, so this activity will not be eligible. It doesn't mean that it's not green, it doesn't mean that it's not sustainable, it just means that it's not in scope of the EU taxonomy. So the first step is to identify what falls into the scope of taxonomy. And it's actually quite difficult in many cases because the definitions that the company uses and the types of works that they have in their balance sheets are sometimes very different from what taxonomy has. They have to be mapped. So the easiest way and the way that is offered by taxonomy itself is to map by NACE codes, by European level industry codes. It doesn't always work because the NACE codes can be quite broad broad and still you need to narrow them down. It can also be done using keywords. For example, you can find by the name what your company does, but in many cases it requires really some in-depth analysis of the company operations to learn the definitions and so on. So for example, we talked to some companies that work in plastics, and they said that it's actually very hard to identify what is the definition of plastics in the EU taxonomy and whether it meets what the company is doing. So things like this. And there are many references to documents there which you can study to understand whether your activities are actually in scope. This is the first challenge, just to identify what you have. The second challenge is to calculate eligible turnover, capex, and opex. For this, you need to have these financial parameters on the activity level, which is not always also the case for the companies. They very often they don't have this data in most cases, so they collect it on the level of individual business units or divisions and so on. So our approach that we took in our tool is to enable creating these units within the activity. So first you add an activity, then you add these units, for example, plants, power plants, depending on what your company does, then you screen them. So this is how we try to help match the corporate reporting system with the EU taxonomy to recreate the same structure, but within the taxonomy process. So this is about eligibility screening. But this is just the first part. So the companies had to do it in 2022. Now they need to move to alignment screening. So to screen on alignment means to answer all the technical screening criteria for each activity and to calculate necessary KPIs. Here, it gets more challenging because currently not all the data that is needed for taxonomy screening is actually collected by companies. In many cases, they just didn't need this information. It was not in previous non-financial reporting standards and so on. Then the problem is that not all criteria are 100% clear, like it is with DNSH, for example. There are many qualitative questions that are hard to interpret. So what can be done? So it is of course good to try to automate screening to a largest possible extent. So for example, if it concerns CO2 emissions, or we can use carbon calculators, or we can collect some data automatically. In our case, in our approach, we do physical climate risk assessment automatically. So we have a separate tool for this, which allows screening different activities on climate scenarios, on RCPs. And it helps to meet the requirements of climate adaptation, both do no significant harm and substantial contribution. So this covers a large part of it. Then, of course, you can always reach out to experts, to consultants, monitor updates and regulations, and try to orient yourself in this field. So this is alignment screening. So for example, in our tool, we tried to make an opportunity to contact consultants in case some questions are not clear, you need some additional guidance, you cannot answer it yourself, you can always reach out to someone. Then what do we have next? Minimum social safeguards. This part is relatively new, so it was there, but very brief and rough. Now it is fully developed. So there is now a separate part on minimum social safeguards, and it requires covering the main standards for human rights. So human rights, bribery, taxation, fair competition. Again, the challenge here will be that not all companies have this data. They probably didn't collect it before. But at the same time, there are some intersections with other sustainability reporting standards which can be investigated and integrated into the reporting. So these are the main steps of EU taxonomy screening. Let's go through them once again and see an example. So this is an example from a technical expert group report on EU taxonomy. I really like the scheme because it's very clear, so let's just walk through it. So here we have total turnover of the company. So the company engages in three types of activities. So they generate coal energy, hydro energy, and wind energy. Now, what happens with coal? Coal is just not in scope of the EU taxonomy. It is not eligible. So we immediately remove coal from here. Hydropower and wind energy are in scope of EU taxonomy, so they're eligible. And now we can screen them. So there are some thresholds. So for wind, there are actually no thresholds. So wind is considered green as it is. So it's kind of already sustainable. For hydro, there are some thresholds and the screening is a little bit more complicated. So if you don't meet them or if you cannot prove that you meet them, you will be not aligned. And now there is do no significant harm part. So it can be related to waste, biodiversity risk like bird collision and all other concerns that are often raised in the context of renewable energy. So it will all fall into the scope of do no significant harm assessment. And finally, the company would undergo social safeguards to see whether its basic social policy meets the taxonomy requirements. And then finally, they get their result. So it's kind of a funnel through which you filter all your activities and it gets narrower and narrower. And finally, you identify your aligned percentage. This is how it goes. It's important to say that you can screen one activity according to different environmental objectives and then select what fits better. So it can be possible that, for example, your hydropower doesn't meet mitigation criteria, but it meets adaptation criteria. And if you can prove that it also does no significant harm to other objectives, you can just calculate it as substantially contributing to adaptation. And this is what you will put in your final tables. So our tool also enables switching between objectives and selecting different criteria. Now, okay, we completed taxonomy screening. What can we do then? So what do we need this for, actually? First, we will be able to meet regulatory requirements. So we will download the report, we will prepare nice tables and put them into our annual report or sustainability report for other people to see our results. Then we can have some analytics. So we can see, for example, what are our weak points, or we can identify to which question we answered no in most cases. So what is it that we can improve? So taxonomy can provide us with all this information. Then, of course, we can communicate our achievements. So if we see that some products are green, we can label them as green, for example, and we can use it for our green marketing, which is very valuable. And this will help us mitigate reputational risks and be ahead of competition and so on. And finally, we can select assets that are eligible for green debt issuance. So within our tool, we have a separate opportunity to select only those assets that are aligned, and then later on transfer them to a green project portfolio and structure a green bond or a green loan to finance or refinance these projects. So this is it. To summarize, EU taxonomy screening includes identifying eligible turnover capex OPEX, screening on alignment, and calculating KPIs. And the main challenges are to map financial data to taxonomy activities, probably one of the biggest challenges, then getting environmental data to screen these activities, and then understanding and calculating KPIs, which is relatively straightforward for companies, but much more complicated for banks and asset managers. Now, what is available on the market? So I really wanted to cover this part so that you can have an idea of a landscape. Who works on this market? Who can help companies with the taxonomy reporting? Of course, there are consultants. There are big four companies and there are other consultants who specialize in taxonomy. There are many advantages of working with consultants. They will prepare detailed analysis of the company, turnkey reports, but there are also problems. So first, very high costs. And second, a lot of back and forth. So there is very low automation. Everything is done kind of manually through Excels and spreadsheets and email. So yeah, you will get a good result in the end, but the process will be quite long and quite expensive. Then you can work with large data providers. There, for example, MSCI, Bloomberg, Refinitiv, so many big data providers have their taxonomy solutions. However, the challenge is that they use only publicly available data. And to enable taxonomy screening, it is not enough to use publicly available data because a lot of this information is just not collected yet. So this approach is convenient for asset managers and banks that need to report on large portfolio. So they cannot afford, to dig into each company. They just don't have time for this. They want an aggregated picture. So they can use this Bloomberg MSCI tools and so on. However, still some data is based on assumptions, and it is not fully transparent how it is collected, and it's often based on public sources and so on. So this is about large data providers. There are also smaller companies, like maybe startups, maybe some IT solutions. Their advantage is that they can target some very specific challenges. So this is why we, in our approach, also work with such providers to get some data from them. For example, there is a company that does DNSH screening for biodiversity, and they specialize only on this, and they do it really well. The problem is that they cannot help you prepare like the integrated taxonomy report. So they cannot cover all the nuances of taxonomy, do calculations and so on, but they will help you collect some specific data which you need for some specific questions. So this is very valuable. It enables new data flows, but also has its limitations. So looking at this is what we try to do. We try to overcome all these challenges. So first, we created a tool that is SAS Plus Consulting. We automate screening process. We help companies go through it. So we walk them through each step, but at the same time, we can consult on financial and environmental issues. And we also integrate a big network of different consultants and data providers. So we have more than 5,000 different experts in our network who we can contact on some specific issues, whether it is carbon footprinting or DNSH and so on. Now we try to use both publicly available and new data. So in some case where it is possible, we get publicly available data, for example, for physical climate risk assessment, and maybe in the future there will be some other data that we integrate. But we also enable collecting new data points from companies when they're not available. And finally, our tool is highly customizable. So we have out-of-the-box solution which enables preparing reports, but we can customize it for each client based on the specific needs, because the companies are very different. Each have their own pain points, own preferences, and this is why we took this approach to enable as much customization as possible, which includes integration with corporate software. So this is about us. Now, while we are preparing for our presentation at UN Climate Conference COP27, we offer a big discount to all companies. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out to us and we'll be happy to show you our demo and guide you through our tool. Okay, so this is the end of my first part. I will pause here and maybe take some questions before we proceed to the EU Greenbon standard.
Hello, may I ask you something? Hi, can you hear me?
Sure.
Yeah, I have a question. I don't know, actually, I thought that I already understand everything and that that it is clear that our company is also obliged to report according to the EU Taxonomy regulation. But now, listening to you, I would like to double check something. If our activity is not listed in the technical screening criteria, so if our activity is not eligible activity, are we obliged to report? We are a company over 500 employees.
You still have to prepare a report, but you will just need to inform in the report that you don't have eligible activities.
And we do not need to really analyze all the expenditure of our company, or we do need to.
So yeah, that depends on the approach. So you can, for example, you can also report on the activities that are not main for your company, but if you can show some eligible and aligned turnover, capex and opex, it is also, of course, it's good for your company. But it doesn't have to be the main activity that you work in.
It means we are not obliged to report. It's just good to report about it. Is that so?
No, so the reporting requirements depends on the size of your company. So if you're in scope of NFRD, you need to provide EU taxonomy report. So you can either say that you don't have any eligible turnover, capex, opex, or you can say that you have some, for example, small.
Okay, so all the companies with more than 500 employees need to report about it, no matter what is the activity.
Listed large companies, more than 500 employees.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, any other questions?
Yes, I have one, if I may.
Sure.
It seems to me that you have some people in this call from the Central or Eastern Europe as well, so it may be relevant for them as well. Do you know, you said that you provide data for these for companies. Do you have an idea on the coverage for these smaller markets? For example, personally, I'm from Croatia, but I guess pretty much any Eastern or Central European countries has the same problem.
Yeah. So our data says that they cover all Europe and other countries as well. So for Europe, we have complete coverage.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? If not, then let's proceed further, and maybe we'll still have time for a small discussion in the end. So I would like to talk a little bit now about EU Greenbon standard. So what is EU Greenbon standard? It is a voluntary standard that is meant to become like a gold standard of green bonds in the European Union. So it is expected to have some benefits. So Europe is already leading in sustainable bond issuance. It's one of the main markets, like very developed, lots of green bonds being issued by different stakeholders. But at the same time, it is expected that EU Green Bond standard will help to further boost this market. So EU Green Bonds are expected to become of the highest quality, like the most transparent, and they will get more interest from investors and so on. And it's also an opportunity to monetize efforts on taxonomy screening. So if the bonds are priced better than the conventional bonds, then you will get some discounts, and obviously this will help to pay off for all the efforts for taxonomy screening. This is the logic behind it. So probably we should go through the green bond process a little bit, because it's not well known for many companies. So what essentially a green bond process covers? There is first eligibility screening part, where you identify what assets can be financed by a green bond or a green loan. In case of EU Green Bond standard, they have to be aligned with the taxonomy. Then the second part is creating a green bond framework. So the framework is a key document which informs the investors about the future use of proceeds. It's like it can be considered as, marketing of a green bond, something that you will send when you want to sell the bond and inform people that it's a green bond. So also in EU GPS, you have to mention your alignment with the EU taxonomy. Then, of course, you issue the bond. Then there is allocation and impact reporting. So allocation is about how much finance was allocated to each project. So you have a project portfolio. Usually the bonds are use of proceeds. So EU Greenbon standard also takes use of proceeds approach, which means that you finance some specific set of projects. An alternative would be general purpose bond, which means that you finance like the overall company without breaking it down to specific projects, but it's more common in case of sustainability linked bonds when you have to meet certain KPIs. So for green bonds, still use of proceeds approach is more common. So you have a project portfolio. You would need to report about allocation, so how much finance was given to each project within this portfolio. And then you would need to do impact reporting about what actually you achieved through this bond. So what emission reduction you achieved through issuance of this bond, and so on. So how did this money contribute to the impact? So this would also need to include contribution to environmental objectives in case of EU taxonomy. And finally, another feature is the mandatory pre-issuance and post-issuance verification. So if you issue just usual green bond under ICMA green bond principles, you don't have to mandatory do verification. It's very much encouraged to do it, but it's not a must. But in case of EU green bond standard, it will be required. So this is in a nutshell what it covers. So let's go through each step. How it works in terms of screening projects. So previously we talked about screening activities, but how does it work with screening projects? So let's say that you're a company and you have some business divisions, and you can then break it down into some projects. So this is essentially the approach that we take in our taxonomy screening in our tool. You break down the company, you identify some small projects that are aligned, then you say that they are eligible, so they can be financed by a green bond. So here it's important not to mix eligibility and alignment. So in taxonomy, eligibility is everything that's in scope, alignment is something green. In EU Green Bond standard, eligible means aligned. So it means that it's eligible for green bond issuance, which means that it's taxonomy aligned. I hope it's clear. It's a little bit confusing, with terms, but it means that you can just take this project and finance it with a green loan. So what happens if your criteria are not there or your activity is not there? Again, you work in agriculture. Does it mean that you cannot issue a bond under green bond standard? Not exactly. So you can use criteria from other taxonomies, but the verifier should confirm this. So for example, you can use climate bonds, which is much stricter than the EU taxonomy. For example, you could use their sector criteria or some other standards if you still want to use green bond standard, but you are not in scope. So this is written in the standard. And green projects can include physical, financial assets, and expenditure, so mostly CapEx. OpEx is usually not financed by this. So this is the first part. Then we have green bond framework. It contains, like I said, details on selection, management, and reporting on proceeds. And in case of EU Green Bond standard, again, it has to include additional information on companies' EU taxonomy alignment. So what we did is we developed a tool which helps preparing a green bond framework based on a set of very simple questions for a company. So in case you didn't have any prior experience with green bonds, you can just walk through this questionnaire and create this document. And as a result, we will put your answers into our pre-generated template, which covers some specific nuances of each standard, and you will be already able to submit this document to a verifier and get your pre-issuance verification and proceed with the green bond issuance. So this is how we try to simplify this process for issuers that don't have a lot of experience in green bonds. It is also a useful tool for investors, like for underwriters, for banks that are helping their clients issue green bonds. So they can also use our tool to walk their clients through these small steps. So what is the unique feature here is that the framework should include additional information on companies' taxonomy alignment. not just the data about the use of proceeds as in other green bond standards. Then we have allocation and impact reporting. In EU Green Bond standard, reports have to be made annually until full allocation. So what it means, let's say you issued the green bond for 10 years. You probably don't distribute all the finance immediately. It will take some time. So maybe 1 year you distribute one half, then another half. And usually in your framework, you put a limit and you say that the bond will be fully allocated within, let's say, 2 years. So before full allocation, you have to prepare annual reports on allocation, and then do the impact reporting at least once based on, they say, transparent methodologies. So there are also different handbooks and guidance from ICMA, from EU Commission on how to report. And also it has to include information on environmental objectives. So to which objective does this project contribute? Again, a link to EU Taxonomy here. And then finally, we have verification. So it has to be done twice. Pre-issuance includes Green Bond Framework and a list of eligible projects. So essentially, you have your EU Taxonomy report verified by someone to see that it's the alignment data is really correct. And then there is post-issuance when full allocation report is prepared. It is also verified. Impact report is not mandatory for verification under EU Green Bond standard. So this is it in a nutshell, the Green Bond standard. It is quite challenging, but at the same time, it is not. So our tool helps automate it to a very large extent. We try to make simpler many processes which are done manually right now, starting from eligibility screening to framework to reporting. External review can also be done on our platform. And yeah, just summing up, I'd like to say that taxonomy brings a lot of new challenges, but also creates great opportunities for fundraising and for green marketing and labeling. And EU Green Bond standard can become later on a gold standard in the EU. So if in case you are looking into this direction, consider it early, and then there will be lots of good opportunities to get benefits out of it. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. Pleasure to have you all. I hope it was useful and interesting. In case you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us through LinkedIn, through email, and we will be happy to help with all your requests related to taxonomy and green finance. Thank you very much.